All right, have you guys ever had a premonition, like that gut feeling that you shouldn't do something or you shouldn't be at a certain place? Well, today I'm going to tell you the story of a man that had that gut feeling. Not only did he have that gut feeling, but he had 3 separate chances to act on that gut feeling and didn't. And as we will see, it turned out to be a tragedy for him and his family. Alright, so I know it's been a while since I posted a video, and I am sorry, but I sort of accidentally started a new YouTube channel, and I've been posting some things on that. So I know you all already love history, and if you like to crochet too, you might want to check that one out. It's called History in Stitches. But basically what we do is we crochet some sort of item, and there's tutorials and all sorts of things up there. And then after we've crocheted the item, we talk about the history of that item. So right now, since it's October, we've been working on these cute little pumpkins, and there's a video up there about the history of Halloween. So if you like to crochet, definitely check it out. But for now, let us talk about William C. Dunbar. So William Dunbar was a Scotsman who, when he was about 18 years old, converted to the Church of Latter-day Saints, which most of us know as the Mormons. He lived in Scotland and had a pretty amazing life. He actually traveled to France and was the 3rd missionary from the church ever to go to France. He came back to Scotland, and then him and his family decided to move to the United States to go out to Utah with the rest of the saints. In 1852, they boarded a ship called the Kennebec, and that took them to New Orleans. They then boarded a steamboat, which took them to St. Louis, and they then had to find another steamboat that would take them west from St. Louis up to Council Bluffs, where they would meet the rest of the saints and get on a wagon train to go the rest of the way to Utah. So William was there, of course, and he was married to his wife, Helen, and they had 2 kids. They had a little baby boy named Franklin, who was about 10 months old, and a daughter named Euphemia, who was about 4 years old. They all made it safely to St. Louis, and once they were in St. Louis, one of the elders of the church went to go find them all passage to the west. Now, when I say them all, it wasn't just the Dunbars and the elder. There was about 175 Mormons in that group traveling. About 330 had come over on the Kennebec, but some had chosen to stay in St. Louis to make some money before they finished their trip. So the elders went and solicited steamboat captains to look for prices and when they could take them upriver, and they found Captain Belt. Now, Captain Belt was the captain of a steamboat called the Saluda. He offered them a pretty cheap rate, and the elders accepted. So the elders suggested that Dunbar and a couple of other saints go look at the Saluda and kind of see what they thought before they finished the passage. Well, Dunbar was there, and there was another saint with the last name of Smoot who also looked at the Saluda, and both of them had premonitions that this was not going to be a good journey. In fact, one account says that Dunbar was so upset and had such a bad feeling when he was on the Saluda that he actually left in tears. He decided to take his family and continue with the Saluda because he had already given his name to the elders, and the elder had already given the name to the captain. But Mr. Smoot actually followed his gut and did not take the Saluda. He actually waited for a different boat called the Isabel. Well, they booked passage, and on the day they were supposed to leave, the Dunbars were waiting at the dock to board the Saluda, but unfortunately their supplies weren't there yet. They waited for their supplies, and they got there about 10 minutes too late. The Saluda left without them. So at this point, he could have given up and said, all right, I had a bad feeling and we missed the boat. Let's just do something else. Unfortunately for his family, he did not say that. He actually went to another steamboat captain and found another captain that they booked passage with, and they were also headed west. But the deal he had with this new captain was that when they caught up with the Saluda, that captain would transfer him and his family and their cargo back to the Saluda so that he could ride with all of the other saints out west. Well, the captain said that was fine and they tried it, but unfortunately there was enough ice left on the river that even though they passed the Saluda a couple of times, they never could make that transfer. Well, that was chance number 2 to skip the Saluda, but he persisted. And apparently, one of the paddle wheels on his new boat was damaged by ice. Now, I've read 2 different versions of the story. One version says that this new steamboat put in at Lexington, Missouri to get its paddle wheel fixed, which happened to be where the Saluda also was. The other story says that this new steamboat had continued upriver, had damaged its paddle wheel, and the captain asked everyone to get off the boat. The Dunbars insisted that the captain drift that boat back down the river and put in at Lexington so that they could then meet up with the Saluda. One way or the other, they managed to meet up with the Saluda on April 8th in 1852. And by the next afternoon, Helen and the 2 kids were both dead, and Mr. Dunbar was left with serious injuries. So a lot of people maybe don't realize how important steamboats were for moving people and cargo west during the early 1850s, but they were extraordinarily important. Steamboats ran the rivers from the 1820s on, but they lost favor when the railroads were finally finished and came through because the railroads were faster and safer. There were a lot of dangers out there for steamboats. And in fact, in one book I was reading, it said that between the years of 1821 to 1861, over 3,000 ships, most of them steamboats, were lost in America's waterways. Steamboats faced a lot of dangers, the biggest of which was snags in the river. Another big thing that happened were steamboat to steamboat collisions, but the craziest accidents were those involving the boilers. So what would happen is that wood would be burned underneath of boilers. The boilers would be filled with water from the river, and then that water would heat up and steam. The steam would be transferred to the engines, which then would use that power to move the steamboat's paddle wheel. Unfortunately, boilers were somewhat notorious for exploding, and that's what happened to the Saluda. So on the morning of April 9th, 1852, William Dunbar recalls that his family was just waking up. His wife was just getting out of bed, and his kids were just getting out of bed, and he decided to step out onto the deck with 2 friends. He told his wife he'd be back in just a minute, and he remembered sitting and talking on the deck with his 2 friends and watching the boat start to pull out of port. Now, the boat had been stuck in Lexington because the Saluda just couldn't seem to get around that particular bend in the river. It was a difficult bend anyway, but it was made worse by the fact that there was still ice in the river, and the Saluda just could not make it around that bend. It had actually damaged itself trying and had to put back in at Lexington for repairs. And according to eyewitnesses, Captain Belt was bound and determined to get around that bend that morning. In fact, he's known for saying that he was going to get around that bend or blow the boat to hell trying. Well, William Dunbar remembers sitting with his friends, seeing the paddle wheel do 2 rotations, and then the next thing he remembers is waking up on the banks of the river. So from my research, it looks like the captain was so determined to get around the bend in that river that he ordered those boilers to be heated up even before the water was put in them. Then he put ice cold river water in the boilers, which basically means those big metal boilers were expanding and contracting at different rates, and that's what they think caused the explosion. Well, the boilers exploded with such force that a 600-pound safe that was in the pilot house was found hundreds of feet up on the bluff. Part of the boilers actually flew through a brick warehouse on shore and knocked part of the warehouse down, and people were scattered throughout the river and the shore. Somebody on shore was actually killed by flying debris. So William Dunbar recalls waking up on the shore, and he thinks that what happened was he was actually blown into the river, pulled out of the river and brought to shore, but the people that did that thought he was dead, so they left him there. When he regained consciousness, he woke up, realized he was soaking wet, had a gaping wound on his head, and unfortunately, he looked next to him and recognized his little baby boy next to him, who was, in fact, dead. People on the bank noticed that William was awake, picked him up, and took him to the makeshift hospital. When he got to the hospital, he arrived just in time to see that his wife had also been brought there, and he witnessed her taking her last few breaths before she passed away. There was a mangled body of a little girl there. Another woman had claimed the little girl as her own, but William said it was his little girl, and it was at that point that he realized that he had lost his whole family. He was severely injured. He had a head wound and had really hurt his back. So ultimately, his wife and both of his children were killed. One of the friends that he was on deck with was also killed. The other survived. And crazy enough, the Isabel had been put into port at Lexington as well. And Mr. Smoot, who is the one who had refused to ride on the Saluda, actually stayed behind in Lexington to help some of the victims of the explosion. The captain of the Isabel offered free passage to any of the other saints willing to still go upriver, and a bunch of people took him up on that and boarded the Isabel and left Lexington. Unfortunately, a lot of people on that boat put in at Council Bluffs eventually and died in a cholera epidemic a little bit later. So the people of Lexington really stepped up. They offered their homes to people recovering from the explosion. They adopted some of the children that were orphaned by the explosion. They raised over $1,000 to help people pay their bills and gain passage up north, and to also help support them while they were recovering. And even to this day, the Mormon church still has a pretty strong connection to Lexington because of all the help the people in Lexington offered their followers. Ultimately, they think about 100 people died in the explosion, but many people were thrown into the river, so we don't have an exact count. So just a few days earlier, a steamboat called the Glencoe had put in at St. Louis, and it exploded as well, though they think that 2 and maybe even 3 of its boilers exploded. It killed at least 30 people, but we again don't have a great count because unfortunately it had exploded just long enough after it had put into port that townspeople, relatives, other people had gotten onto the boat to help unload or see their families, and some of the passengers on the boat had gotten off. People were thrown into the river, people were traveling, and we just don't have good records of how many people actually died in that explosion. Congress had already started to make inroads about making some laws about steamboat safety, but these 2 explosions really pushed Congress over that edge, and they passed some legislation to help with steamboat safety, make some steamboat inspections necessary, and things like that. So there is one final and sad chapter to this story. So William Dunbar, of course, survived, and after spending some time recovering, he did make it out to Utah. He ended up remarrying and had 13 kids, one of which he named Helen Euphemia after his wife and his daughter. He turned out to be pretty successful. Apparently, he was a very funny man, good at the bagpipes, and he started, or at least helped to start, a newspaper in the area. But I'm going to read you one of the quotes from his account of the sinking. It says, "My other child, a little girl about 5 years old, was lying in the same room among the dead, her body so mangled that I could scarcely recognize her, and in fact so hard was it to identify her that a lady survivor also claimed her as her child. I have on several occasions since reasoned on the possibility of my being mistaken in identifying the body of my child, and wondered if it could be possible that my little girl was among those who fell into the hands of the special committee appointed by the citizens of Lexington to take care of the orphan children. Some of the people into whose care these children were entrusted were very reluctant to give them up when asked to do so by relatives or friends, and it's quite possible that 1 or 2 of them were never recovered." So even after all those years, he's having doubts if that was his daughter, and his daughter may have still been out there somewhere, which is just terribly sad. So if you're ever in the Lexington, Missouri area, so just a little bit east of Kansas City, Lexington is just a fantastic historic town anyway, but they do have a memorial to the Saluda victims, and there is a graveyard there where there's another separate memorial that some of the Saluda victims were buried in. So definitely an interesting visit. All right, well, don't forget to listen to those gut instincts, and I will see you next time.